So this episode is an important one because I think we're both free speech lovers, and free speech or freedom of speech is the most important freedom that we have. It's the bedrock of our democracy. And so I'm excited to talk about the importance of the First Amendment with you, Adam Sieff, the influence of special interests on our governance system, what we can do to mitigate it, and the role or the non-role of third parties in our political system. Mm-hmm. So you're a media and constitutional litigator with Davis, Wright & Tremaine, where you focus on issues involving online speech regulation. You represent internet, media, and technology clients in First Amendment, Section 230, copyright, trademark, antitrust, and others. And you're also the chair of the Hollywood chapter of Govern for California, which is a nonprofit advocating for the public's interest in the California State Legislature. So we'll cover all of that. Anything else you would like to add in your introduction?
No, I'm a lifelong Angelino, and I've been
What's Angelino?
From Los Angeles.
Oh, okay.
And I came home after a number of years away. I'm committed to the idea of California, and I believe in California, and I believe in Los Angeles. So I'm excited to talk with you today about all of that and some of the interesting issues involving the First Amendment and online speech.
I appreciate that you're not planning to leave, because a lot of talented people and businesses are leaving California for states like Texas or Florida, because the situation here is very bad in terms of quality of life. The crime and homelessness in Los Angeles is really unprecedented, and in terms of business as well.
We certainly have challenges. I don't deny that. I think on balance, and we could talk about this some more, the opportunities here continue to be as strong as they are anywhere else in the country. I think that all big cities and all big states are going through challenging times right now. And there's some common sense solutions that I hope that we could advocate to have the government implement and attempt here in Los Angeles and throughout California to see if we can make a difference. I
like that you said the word common sense. It's my favorite word. And Thomas Paine is my favorite founding father.
Love it.
So what solutions? Let's get into it. What are your suggestions?
Oh man, where do I start? I think that if you ask people what's a challenge in California, you mentioned quality of life. I think that the principal challenge that California faces is a function of its affordability. And this isn't entirely new, but it's become increasingly unsustainable.
Affordability of housing, mainly?
I think housing for most people is the largest expense that they have, whether it's rent or a mortgage payment. Housing is a significant, and perhaps the most significant cost that people have each month. For that reason, I think that a principal way that we would have to address the affordability crisis in California is to pursue more rational housing policies. I'm certainly not the foremost expert on this, but as someone who cares about the state and who cares about these issues, I've been involved with and followed along with folks who are active in the YIMBY movement. And
what's that?
The Yes in My Backyard movement. These are people who are generally supportive of efforts to build more housing. Mm-hmm. These are folks who I think correctly identify our housing affordability crisis, which is a principal driver of our overall affordability crisis, as deriving from a failure to build housing at all market levels over the past 40, 50 years in particular. The state had continued to grow. We're unfortunately not growing right now. We'll see what happens in the next few years. The pandemic, I think, shook things up a little bit. We still are an incredibly attractive place to be, but we're not growing. And yet at the same time, despite not growing, the Los Angeles Times, you probably saw, reported that there's still not enough housing, and we're still not building enough housing.
And why is that? Is it the bureaucracy, the permits that are required to get anything started?
I think there are policy choices. There are policy choices about zoning. There's policy choices about permitting. There are policy choices about the way that we subject public and private development projects to extensive review processes whose purposes were originally intended as originally intended, were good. We don't want people building massive skyscrapers in single-family home neighborhoods, nor do we want precious natural resources to be destroyed. But the way that these laws and these review systems have been abused over the past 30 years by interest groups, whether it's a homeowners association or a union or a competitor who's trying to extract or extort some type of benefit or concession. Rent seekers, exactly. So we've created opportunities for rent seeking with these policies. And the unfortunate outcome is that we haven't built enough housing. Where we have built housing they're in places that are far afield from good jobs and from economic opportunity and educational opportunity. That compounds the environmental issues that we're trying to address in this state. Work from home makes things a little bit better, and perhaps electric vehicles and electrified network of charging stations could be part of a suburban solution to this problem. But we also are just running out of space. We're building homes that are crawling up canyons and hillsides that burn. And we can't build in those spaces. And I think that personally, and I know that there's been some studies on this, I think I've observed anecdotally there's something about urban environments that is conducive to creativity and entrepreneurship. There are economic reasons for this too, but I think we lose something, some dynamism, if we're just all far field in homes, because that's the only place we could build, or out in exurbs in rural areas. That doesn't seem like the solution to our problem. There's moderate infill housing that we could build. The missing middle, you go to cities around the world and it looks different. I think that you could have a California dream with the space and the living space and the outdoor space, and still live in a sane, sort of sensible urban environment. We just need to enact the policies that permit us to build that type of housing. It's illegal to build that type of housing right now in a lot of places.
Or remove the regulation that prevents this housing to be built.
I think that's right. I think that we need to deregulate the way that housing is permitted and enabled or disabled from being built in California.
So realistically, how do you think we can do that? Is Govern for California taking part in that?
So Govern for California is an organization that was founded about 10 or 12 years ago by a number of what I'll call political philanthropists. These are individuals who had been successful in the private sector. A lot of them were in venture capital, but not exclusively. And a lot of them had government experience.
Wait, venture capitalists with government experience? That doesn't sound right to me.
It was a mix. The organization was founded, for example, by David Crane. David Crane was a professor of mine when I was in law school at Stanford, and David was a teacher at Stanford. And David is a Democrat, but he served in the Schwarzenegger administration. And his time in the Schwarzenegger administration, and this was something he did after having a long career in business, he determined that the way that the state was run didn't make sense, and that there were interest groups that had outsized influence on public policies that undermined the public's interest in an effective government that delivered quality services to people who need them. And the organization was founded to sort of counteract these the outsized influence of those interest groups by creating an interest group for the public interest, which is a sort of a novel concept. You can imagine that there are, you could think of there are a lot of interest groups that are multi-issue private interest groups, or single-issue private interest groups, or maybe even a single-issue public interest group like, the Sierra Club. But there's not really a multi-issue public interest group, a group that takes on a bunch of issues on the public's behalf. And so that's what Govern for California tried to do, and the model is to provide campaign finance funding to elect and support state legislators, to give them the freedom to vote their conscience and vote their conscience and vote their district, as opposed to voting in a particular way because of the realistic pressure that is exerted upon them by the interest groups that are resident in Sacramento and push on this every single day.
Yeah.
So you asked about housing and whether Govern takes this issue on. I'm not aware that Govern has made housing a priority yet. It's a divisive issue in the state, and Govern is a broad spectrum of supporters. I mean, there are folks like me who are left of center. There are folks who are right of center, and there are people who I imagine voted. I know there are folks who voted for Bernie. I know there are folks who voted for Trump in elections before, and we're all part of the same organization. So it takes a while for folks to find consensus, and housing is a tricky issue to find consensus on. But I think
why is that? It seems quite straightforward.
Well, maybe for you and me, but there are people who are very sensitive to the character of their neighborhoods, and that's understandable. You know, my wife and I are fortunate enough to own a home in Los Angeles, and when there's major construction down the street or next door, it's you kind of there's an instinctive reaction to kind of be concerned and defensive about what's going on in your in your neighborhood, in your backyard.
And it's reasonable the value of your house would go down with increased supply. So it does make sense why some people fight against construction.
For sure, there are rational, from a purely and I was addressing some of the more emotional reactions that I think drive some of the opposition to housing reform policies. But there's certainly rational reasons too, as you allude to. You know, someone might be in a home already, wants to pull the ladder back up to restrict supply in order to keep the value of their home artificially inflated by a restricted supply.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what we were saying at the beginning, is that the affordability crisis in California is driven primarily, in my view, by a housing shortage. And it's a supply side problem, and there's a supply side solution, which is to make it easier to build more housing.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of Govern for California, how do you determine the issues that you advocate for? Do you run polls?
So Govern has a series of chapters. It's sort of a decentralized organization with strong centralized leadership that we sort of consider and take cues from and evaluate independently. So the central unit of Govern for California includes researchers who evaluate issues that are pending before the legislature or should be pending before the legislature and determine on a yearly basis what we ought to make our priorities. And we convene and discuss these through meetings, through email. There's discussion, and a set of priorities emerges each term.
Is it difficult to reach compromise, given you have people from all over the spectrum, the Bernie supporters, the Trump supporters?
I think so. I think that's why we haven't, we haven't, for instance, figured out what we want to do on housing yet, because my point of view might be different from someone's point of view in Atherton.
Yeah.
But we do find consensus on enough issues that we then decide to make those issues the things that we're going to focus on. So, for instance, a few years ago, probably it's not a very sexy win, but it's an important one. Mm-hmm. And I know that you're interested in deregulation, so I think you like this. We recognized a problem, and that was that in rural parts of the state, access to healthcare was limited and costs were high. As a result, this was not just an equity issue where you had folks who were living in rural areas not getting access to care. Mm-hmm. You also had Medi-Cal, the state Medicaid program, which funds healthcare for low-income Californians, paying more than it needed to for healthcare because they're just the market dynamics didn't support more cost-efficient service delivery. And so we picked up the mantle, working with, of all people, the nurses union, one of the most progressive unions in the state, to change the scope of practice requirements for nurses, to enable nurses, who mm-hmm. there are more nurses in these areas than there are doctors, or at least there are enough nurses to provide critical mass to support those doctors, that by liberating them from regulatory restraints on the types of medicine that they could practice without supervision, we were able to increase access to care and at the same time bring down the cost of healthcare in those communities and for every taxpayer in the state of California.
So you do work with unions. You do work with special interest groups.
I think that
in a way.
I think that it's important to understand that interest groups are just part of politics, right? I mean, it's inherent. If you read the Federalist, Madison talks about faction and the problem of faction. But again, his solution isn't to get rid of faction. It's to make faction work in support of the broader good and by pitting them against each other. Govern takes a similar approach, which isn't so much to say that we develop a system of government to pit interests against each other. That's the goal of our Constitution. But what we recognize is that interest groups exist. Factions exist. They always will exist. And what matters is building partnerships and coalitions, pragmatically and realistically, issue by issue, to get things done. And so we do work with unions. We worked with unions there. We also worked with unions and the governor earlier last year, I should say, in 2022, to defeat a ballot initiative that corporate special interests had put on the ballot. There were some companies funded primarily, or there was a ballot initiative funded primarily by companies like Lyft, the ride-sharing service, that wanted to raise taxes in order to create a slush fund that companies like it could use to electrify their fleet instead of using their own capital reserves or investment funds to do that. Because the state had passed a law requiring them to electrify their fleet. And rather than pay for it themselves, they saw an opportunity to have taxpayers do it. And understandably, a broad range of organizations, including Govern for California, took the mantle of leadership to stop that. That was Prop 30. The governor supported us in defeating that proposition.
Did you run a referendum?
It was a no campaign. So it was.
How do you defeat a ballot initiative then?
By getting people to vote no.
Getting people to vote no.
Yeah. So the governor was on our side, but as a number of labor unions were. The teachers union, I think, as a matter of fact, was opposed to this because the teachers union might have supported raising taxes, but they didn't want it to go into a special slush fund that wouldn't be accessible to schools. And so, you had folks who were rigidly opposed to any kind of tax. You have folks who like tax, but it helped them. And you had people like us who just want good government and get special interests out of the trough, work together to defeat that. And so it's an example of how I think politics needs to work, which is working together in coalitions. And, sometimes you'll be on the same side and other times you'll disagree. But what matters is that people are advocating for what they believe is right and in the public interest, and to ensure that there is a seat at the table for the general public.
So do you think that without your role in this opposition to this ballot initiative, these organizations wouldn't be able to work together? They wouldn't be able to build coalitions to oppose this?
Well, I think that other groups often do work together in coalition to achieve or block policy
And again,
changes.
they're not trying to represent the public interest. They're representing their own interest. That
I
could
think that's
happen
right.
to be the public interest.
I think that's right. I mean, we're acting. I mean, look, this is all at a certain point. It's subjective. We believe what we're doing is in the public interest. It's not like we're not like Rousseau, where we're like sitting there in the polling booth and like discerning from heaven like what the general will is, and then like enacting it. I mean, this is what is in the public's interest is inherently going to vary person to person. But we have a strong belief of what the public interest is. The general idea is that the public interest is providing quality services to people who need it at efficient cost in a sustainable way. And
representing the majority?
In order to benefit the majority, exactly. And sometimes those interests will align with the private interests of a faction or an interest group, and sometimes it won't. And our job is to bring people together. I know for a fact that for this ballot initiative campaign we were just talking about, Govern for California took the lead and was essential. Helped raise the money, coordinated the media strategy. I think that we're very proud of what we were able to do there.
Do you think that ballot initiatives are a good way to because they were meant to be
Mm-hmm.
the way that the people's voice would be heard,
Mm-hmm.
that
Yeah.
would circumvent the legislature,
Mhm.
right? That was the idea.
Yeah.
But in recent years, they've been used by corporations to promote their agendas.
Yeah.
So do you think that ballot initiatives are net positive or net negative?
I mean, it's an excellent question. I think you're exactly right. The ballot initiatives originated in the early part of the 20th century in response, in California at least, to the railroads, right? The railroads were the most powerful special interests. And you had, I think, Governor Hiram Johnson, right? A progressive reformer, sort of like a Teddy Roosevelt kind of a person. And among other things, created the initiative process, created the referendum process, created the recall process to sort of put power back in the hands of the people. And the idea, as you suggest, is that when the ordinary levers of government become captured, or else are forced to take a position against their own incumbency, the interest of their own incumbency, there's a safety valve in the form of a plebiscite, in the form of a popular initiative. And so that's the idea. You've identified the problem, though, which is that over the years, the corporations and unions, in particular in California, have taken to the ballot in order to achieve special privileges. And this, what Lyft was trying to do was consistent with that. It wasn't sinister. It's just what people do. It's understandable. You can't blame people for trying to do what's in their interest. That's the nature of our political system, is that people will pursue their interest. The challenge is that we don't always have. It's a collective action problem, right? The latent interest of many is tougher to organize. It's much easier to organize very narrow, acute interests for small numbers of people, and that's what's happened with the ballot. Oftentimes, is that you don't have ballot initiatives that serve the public. You have ballot initiatives that are pitched as serving the public, but in fact, maybe primarily, if you actually read what the laws are doing, serve narrow interests. So I think on balance, in an ideal world, no ballot in it, to borrow from Madison again. If men were angels, no ballot initiative would be necessary. Right?
No government would be necessary.
No government would be necessary, but nor would ballot initiatives. Exactly, I was paraphrasing.
Yeah.
But I think that ballot initiatives, my mind is changing on them. I think that for a long time I thought, and I still worry about the way that governing through ballot initiative works. We can't budget through ballot initiative. It's not a sensible or sane process. What you really need are legislators in a legislature to be responsible. And Government for California, for example, is focused on that. But I think increasingly good government advocates are going to be attracted to the ballot as an opportunity to correct some of the, in particular, structural problems that we face in our system.
I mean, as you said, that's what Schwarzenegger did.
Mm-hmm.
When he came into office, he was just passing one ballot initiative after another.
Mm-hmm.
And it's much more difficult to raise resources for a ballot initiative in public's interest than it is for a ballot initiative that represents the corporate interest or special interest.
I think you're right. I mean, I think that's undoubtedly true. And you're right. In 2010 and in those years, we passed independent redistricting,
open primaries.
Right, exactly. Top two primaries. Those reforms, the political parties didn't like those reforms, but I think on balance those were important and necessary, and have, in my opinion, borne fruit. I think they've turned out well. You see now cities and counties are supporting independent redistricting commissions as opposed to political redistricting processes. So I think we'll see more of that.
Do you think that these reforms are enough? Or what other reforms would you implement to make our system more competitive? Because as you know, California is a one-party state. The Democrats have supermajority in the Assembly and in the Senate, and Republicans have no voice.
Well, I wouldn't say they have no voice. I mean, it's not so much that no one is censoring them. No one is telling Republicans they can't run for office. I think that right now they're just, unfortunately, this is your question is more about a problem with the Republican Party as opposed to our party system. I think there are lots of sensible, quality Republicans. Arnold Schwarzenegger, is a sensible, in some respects, Republican, more conservative than me on some issues, but someone that I think has, in a lot of ways, been a champion for example, a greener economy. He's someone who's empathetic and compassionate and oriented towards the public good, or what he conceives to be the public good, even if I disagree with him. And I think that right now the Republican Party nationally, and sort of trickling down into local politics, is enthralled with the cult of personality of a person who's just, his appeal is that I am your, what was his phrase? I am your revengeance. I mean, I'm not sure that's what he said. I mean, it's the idea is that I am your retribution. That's what he said. That's what the former president said, and that sort of vindictive, divisive, suspicious, conspiratorial thinking is not conducive to the type of ordinary interest-based politics that our polity was predicated on. I mean, our government was predicated on the idea that power would be shared and shift, that no one would permanently hold a seat of power, but we would compete, and politics ended at the water's edge, and that at the end of the day we were all citizens of the same republic, and we were brothers and sisters, we're all Americans. And I think that is something that we've lost, and there's a sense where people don't, there's no longer norms of withholding or forbearing from doing maximalist or pursuing maximalist aims. It's not enough simply to hold office and pass portions of your agenda that consensus of representatives could support. You need to destroy the opposition. And I think that's the problem at the core of the Republican Party. The Democratic Party has its own problems, but the Republican Party in California is it's a toxic brand. You've probably heard that before. People say it's toxic, and I think that's the problem. I wish we had a stronger Republican Party, but what you have instead is you have different shades of Democrat.
I wish we had more parties in the first place. I think if you look at politics in the 60s, the Democratic and the Republican Party had several factions within them that had to work together to pass legislation. You had the conservative Democrats, which Kennedys are, but you had the progressive Republicans. But after the civil rights era, I feel like the parties have moved away from each other, and they have become more extreme and more uniform in their viewpoints. So if you're a Democrat, you could pretty much 100% say how that person feels on every issue: abortion, immigration, economy.
Yeah.
If you're a Republican, you can do the same thing.
Yeah.
I think what we need is more factions within those parties, at least, that would represent the people.
I think the way you just put it is actually similar to the way I've put it, which is that if you know someone's position on any given issue, you could predict with near certainty, how they're going to view other issues. And that sort of programmatic thinking, I think, is anathema to the idea of shifting coalitions and Federalist 10 and Federalist 51 that we were talking about earlier. That sort of concentration and coalescence around dogmatic identity is difficult in a political system like ours. I think that in California there are factions of Democrats. Maybe there's not dozens. But there are shades of blue, as people say, right? And nationally, I think you see that as well. The challenge with having more parties is that our system is a first past the post system, and we talked about this briefly earlier.
Yeah.
But I think that given the way we elect our representatives, and what I mean by first past the post is that you have
single member districts.
Exactly.
Plurality.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Which is different, right, from the way that like a parliament is elected.
Yes.
And in a parliamentary system, you're able to channel nuanced differences into minority parties, which can sometimes exercise power in a coalition. There are a lot of problems with parliamentary democracy. As you talk to a political theorist who studied Weimar Germany or other European parliaments in the 20th century could tell you about.
They always say that it was parliamentary democracy that brought Hitler to power.
Yeah. And that's sort of what I'm alluding to.
Yeah.
But I'm not saying Hitler is always an extreme example. But I mean, there are problems with parliamentary democracy in terms of stability and asserting authority that you don't have in the sort of legislative system that we have, in the presidential system that we have.
I think it's more responsive, though.
It certainly is more responsive. Our system is designed not to be responsive. Yeah. Our system is purposefully designed to make policy making difficult, but it's predicated on the idea that there's a culture of civic virtue or companionship that's underlying our political culture. Yeah. And when you lose that, which is not legal, right? These are sort of extra legal characteristics of a polity. When you lose
unwritten political norms.
Exactly, the unwritten, 100%. When you lose the unwritten political norms, the system jams up, and there's people people want something to be done. They say, well, why don't it'd be better if we just had a parliamentary system where the prime minister and the government it was programmatic and they could do whatever they want, and then we have a snap election in a couple of years, and then they do the opposite, and we'll just go back and forth forever. I'm not sure if that's better. Ideally, we would figure out what we've lost and find a way to work together. I think that I felt more confident that we were moving in that direction nationally maybe 10 years ago.
That was what, Obama?
During the Obama presidency, you had a fringe group of Republicans who would shut the government down, and
the filibuster has been used like 300 times last year,
yes.
from like 7 times 20 years ago.
Yes, yeah. That's an example of a minoritarian institution that I think if you look, there's a study by political scientists. I think they're at George Washington University. Over time, they tracked the use of the filibuster. It's been exponential in its growth, and it's not just that, right? It's
same with executive orders.
Exactly. Right. So filling the vacuum left behind from legislation is sort of this provisional governance through executive action, expansion of the executive power generally relative to the other branches. I think you're seeing the judiciary trying to reassert itself in expansive ways over both the executive and the legislative branches. For lawyers who are listening may appreciate the development, the discovery, I should say, of the major questions doctrine, which is not written anywhere in the Constitution. You won't see it written down, but the court currently has sort of arrogated to itself the authority to determine whether an issue is so important that like an administrative agency probably shouldn't be the one to rule on it. And there's merit to concern that agencies are sort of runaway bureaucracies that are doing things without accountability, but the question to ask is sort of, well, who is ultimately then the decision maker? And the court, to some extent, is saying, well, we're going to play a larger role. So there's a lot to discuss. I think that there's a lot to discuss and to pursue structurally within our system to try and ungrind the gears of government at the federal level. The state level, it's not so much ungrinding the gears of government as it's trying to restore balance and sort of equilibrium to the way that we govern ourselves, because you say it's a one-party state. I think that I'm not so concerned by the fact that Democrats have supermajorities as I am by the fact that the Democrats within those supermajorities oftentimes seem to be overly directed by the most powerful special interests of the state.
Well said. So how do we fix it? How would you go back to the culture of civic virtue? How do we get out of this doom loop where one party is trying to destroy the other party and we're not tolerating opposition anymore? We see them as illegitimate.
Yeah. If I had the answer, I think that if anyone had the answer, we'd be in a different world right now. But I think that it requires some sort of self-summoning. I think at the end of the day, individuals have to take responsibility for themselves and their communities and their country. This isn't something, there's no magic bullet. I think that, one thing I've heard that we haven't tried, but that seems promising to me, maybe on the margins, maybe more than on the margins, is Pete Buttigieg just talked about national service, mandatory national service. Not necessarily military service, but like AmeriCorps or something like that.
What is that? AmeriCorps? AmeriCorps? What is that?
AmeriCorps is I think it's for like recent college graduates. It might also be folks who've graduated high school. but it's for young people primarily to spend a year or two working with other Americans from other parts of the country, kind of like the Peace Corps, doing domestic service work, and just whether it's going into cities and like providing support services to lower income folks, or teaching in schools, or helping kids with after school programs, or like environmental related project. It's just a service oriented project for a year or two.
Would it be volunteering or paid?
The AmeriCorps is paid. I think it's doesn't pay much, as I remember. I looked into it when I was younger.
And that would be mandatory after high school or after college?
I think the proposal that people have talked about is that at some point before the age of maybe 25, all Americans spend a year in some kind of paid national service. And if I've heard versions of this, well, maybe you don't make it mandatory, but if you participate, you get like a tuition credit, or you get some kind of vocational training credit that you could use towards a career afterwards. But the idea is that it's sort of it's not so much the service itself that is instrumental towards curing the culture that we were just describing. It's the foisting of people from different backgrounds into a common cause that builds bonds.
Which is America.
Which is America at its best. And I think that, the military traditionally has been an important institution in this country, in part because it brings people together from different places. The military is one of the first institutions in the country to integrate. And those sorts of connections and collaborations produce bonds of affection that can be conducive to a polity that it fundamentally just we don't trust one another.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that will create opportunities to build public trust between citizens is part of the solution that we have to try and find ways to pursue.
I think it's a great idea. It will get us from the online world into the physical world, which we don't spend much time in.
Not as much.
Increasingly, we live in simulation, on Zooms or in video games.
Yeah.
We have to touch grass, as they say. So I'm curious, where does your funding come from, Govern for California? You said you support campaign finance.
Yes. We make political contributions.
You make political contributions through a PAC, I assume.
Through a series of PACs.
And where do the funds come from?
Individual donors exclusively. Individual donors, and it's word of mouth. I mean, we network with people who are, the types of philanthropists who give money to major charities, foundations, and we explain that there's an opportunity to do as much good by supporting candidates for public office, potentially, and at a margin of the cost. So the cost of a political campaign, even in a city like Los Angeles, which has an expensive media market, and so it's the cost of media which drives the cost of campaigns. But even in an expensive media market, $1 million is a significant amount of money for a campaign. In most parts of the state, a few $100,000 is all it takes. And there are enough philanthropists in California who support traditional philanthropic causes, who donate 6 figures each year to a series of philanthropies or more, or 7 figures, right? That if we could carve off a portion of their generosity for political contributions, for political philanthropy, we think that it's, to borrow one of David Crane's phrases, he says that, the good you can do through politics is like a mispriced asset, right? The cost of influencing an election to elect a quality candidate who would not otherwise get elected is low relative to the value that legislature could achieve. The state budget is like $200 billion annually. And if you could influence enough legislators, you could steer a significant portion of the discretionary expenditure that the state makes each year, as well as influence the way that sort of the fixed expenditures are made in the medical system and education and whatnot. And that has there's a tremendous multiplying effect, in other words, of a relatively small contribution to a series of legislative office holders, to the good that those office holders can do in office if they're liberated to make decisions in their the best interests of their districts and in the public interest generally.
Well, talking about campaign finance, I would be curious to hear your opinion on the recent 2010 Citizens United ruling,
Mm-hmm.
and then also the Buckley v. Valeo 1974 ruling, which is what led to the rise of lobbyists and corporations influencing our politics. Do you think that restricting campaign financing restricts free speech, restricts the quantity of speech, which was the main argument?
Yeah, so let's start with Buckley and sort of the idea of political contributions in speech.
Mm-hmm.
And then we could talk about Citizens United, which I think is a misunderstood case.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yes, like fundamentally, I think that expenditures or contributions for or against a political candidate or cause, these are expressive core political speech activities. You could imagine wanting to print a bunch of flyers to advocate for a particular candidate of your choice. That costs money. You mentioned Thomas Paine. I mean, like the lonely pamphleteer at some point expends resources in order to get his or her message out. And the Supreme Court of the United States, correctly in my view, has understood that expenditures on campaigns, both made by candidates and also by individuals supporting those candidates, are not just comparable to, but of the same substance as the expenditures of resources to flyer or to organize a community in favor or against a particular political point of view. So what Buckley versus Valeo considered, and this was a case in the 70s that followed after Watergate, Congress passed comprehensive federal election regulation act, and
which established the FEC,
which,
I believe,
among other things, established the FEC, and the act set forth a series of restrictions. First, on the amount of money that individuals and corporations and others could donate to campaigns, limited the amount of money campaigns could spend, and then also imposed limits or considered imposing limits on the expenditures individuals could spend, not as contributions, but as just personal expenditures to influence an election. Buying a billboard or something for your favorite candidate or for...
So not directly working with the campaign, but influencing it indirectly.
That's right. Sort of an independent expenditure, it's called. And the Supreme Court said that, well, you could regulate the contribution because when you make a contribution to a candidate, we're worried about either actual or the appearance of corruption in the form of a quid pro quo, like a bribe. And there's a legitimate government interest in preventing the appearance of a bribe, or in fact, preventing actual bribes. And so for that reason, you could limit the direct contributions that are made to candidates, because those are considered to be the most impactful, which create the most direct connection between a supporter, a donor, and a candidate. But you can't limit the expenditure, and you can't limit an individual's expenditure or the campaign's expenditure. And the rationale had to do with, again, going back to the idea of this is core political speech, and we cannot, even for there's a passage of the opinion which addresses this. So even for like the aim of trying to level the overall field of speech, to create opportunities for other people to get their message out, you can't suppress some people's speech in order to elevate others. And that insight, to me, reflects our tradition and reflects the values that we have as a community. But again, it's not just that we've always done it this way. I think that it makes sense intuitively that one person's speech is equal to that of another person's, and artificial restrictions on their ability to get their message out rub the wrong way and introduce a type of censorship.
And this was way before social media.
This was way before, that's right. And there's all kinds of there's complicated regulations now about like when something like, unearned media can be construed as a contribution or an expenditure or something you have to report or consider. But and this was in a time of predominantly print and broadcast. Citizens United considered a portion of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, the McCain-Feingold bill. And specifically, it involved a restriction on whether a corporation could create an independent expenditure within a certain amount of time of an election. And the Supreme Court held it was basically a media regulation. It was more of a media law than a campaign finance law. But the court held in a controversial opinion that I think ultimately, as a First Amendment practitioner, I think was correctly decided. The court held that the ability of a corporation to expend money from its general treasuries couldn't be limited even for political purposes, if they wish to use those funds for political purposes. Corporations indisputably have speech rights. They not only have constitutional rights, they have speech rights. Yeah. The New York Times Corporation is the publisher of the New York Times. They have speech rights. Bantam Books, right? That's a corporation. They have speech rights, and those are two of the most important cases during the heyday of the Warren Court in establishing the breadth and rigor of First Amendment protection. There was an argument that, these corporations, they have money in their treasuries because of products that they sell or services they provide. No one gives them money. I don't buy a toothbrush because I like the way that Crest is going to, or Johnson & Johnson or whomever is going to spend money to influence elections. But it's, it's not a function of how they obtained their resources. It's a function of whether they can use those resources to express themselves. Mm-hmm. The solution to that type of concern, by the way, is not to patronize businesses whose speech you don't approve of. And so there's a perfect First Amendment response. For example, people just, maybe you don't want to go to Chick-fil-A because they disagree with Chick-fil-A's approach to homosexuality and same-sex marriage, and maybe they oppose just the sort of Christian conservative viewpoint of that corporation generally. People don't advertise on Fox because they don't support its message. There are First Amendment solutions. It's just not to patronize the business. And so the Supreme Court sort of rejected that argument and overturned a prior case, which said that these concentrations of wealth in some ways are distorting and unearned. So, the empirical data, there was an essay by Floyd Abrams in 2019 on this, and I'll let you get to the next subject, but I was just reading this actually. Floyd Abrams, who's a legendary First Amendment lawyer, wrote an essay in 2019 in which he found that in the wake of Citizens United, corporate political spending didn't shoot up through the roof. It remained more or less the same. Individual super PACs, people before he passed like Sheldon Adelson, Bloomberg, right? The individuals made massive, like $100 million contributions to super PACs, but that had nothing to do with Citizens United.
Well, Citizens United led to the increase in super PACs.
There was a case called Speech Now, which was decided by the D.C. Circuit, which held that super PACs could raise an unlimited number of, which would say that PACs, independent expenditure committees, could raise an unlimited number of money and spend an unlimited. They already could spend an unlimited amount of money, but this said you could raise an unlimited amount of money. And I think, again, it's hard to say how that's incorrect. I think that if you accept the premise that an individual has the right to expend resources on an election in any way that they choose as a matter of fundamental speech, joining together with others in a corporate entity, because a corporation at the end of the day is just a group of people who create a
product or service.
Not even. It's an association. It's like a partnership that has a special legal characteristic, and the legal characteristic isn't particularly relevant to the way the money is spent. It just is a way to organize a bank account and collectively hold a bank account in a way. If an individual could spend any amount of money that they want, why can't they spend any amount they want to support in confluence with others and pooling their money together, and then having that entity take the pooled funds from that single bank account and influence elections? I'm not saying that these are good things by themselves. There should be...
Well, that was my follow-up question.
Yeah.
Doesn't that go against the mission of Govern for California, to represent the public interest, to represent the majority?
I think that it certainly raises the risk that you would have people who will use these vehicles to influence elections in ways that are privately interested. But again, that is the challenge of our system of government. Is at some point there's you have to summon for yourselves the restraint not to abuse the rights that you possess and the powers that you have. And what Govern for California's philosophy is again consistent with, I think, the idea of America, which is that these factions are going to exist. Super PACs are going to exist. Yeah. People with wealth, as if our economy continues to produce unequal gains, you will have large concentrations of wealth, and people will use that wealth to influence politics. The solution is not so much to squelch the speech; it's more speech. It's to bring together people who want to speak in favor of the public interest, and to use these same neutral tools, super vehicles for expression and influence, to bring to bear influence on behalf of the public. And that's the approach that Govern takes. And I think that's the approach that the First Amendment and the Constitution requires. And again, it ultimately turns on finding people of goodwill who are willing to be philanthropic with their wealth and sort of use it to advance policies that maybe don't line their own pockets, but are the right thing to do. I can tell you, I don't think anyone in Govern for California had any direct material remunerative benefit from enabling nurses in rural parts of the Central Valley to expand their scope of practice. But it was the right thing to do, and it helped a lot of people.
I actually agree with you on the point that we shouldn't be restricting the amount of funds that is spent on campaigns. But I think that we should break the bond between the donors and the politicians and the campaigns. Right now you have lobbyists that have a significant influence on politics, on policy making. And if we anonymize donations, then I think that could have a positive effect on our democracy, and that could lead to politicians actually passing policy in the interest of the public, not the corporations. So you can give as much money as you want to a campaign, but that politician is not going to know where the money is coming from.
It's an interesting idea.
So completely anonymize campaign finance.
I would say that I hadn't thought about that in depth before. Off the top of my head, one reaction is that in some ways you want the transparency to know where the money comes from. And in practice, it may not work as intended, because...
I don't think public scrutiny is effective enough to make a change.
Maybe not. But what I would say to you is this. When a bigwig politician comes to town and has a $50,000 a plate dinner, they know who's at the table, even if the check comes in without any names on it. And so I wonder whether anonymizing the donations alone would get you to where you need to get.
So there is a book on it. It's called Voting with Dollars, and it has a concept of a secret donation booth, where you donate the money, there would be a vehicle or a trust, and the money would then be allocated to the campaign in batches in randomized batches, so that politician or their staff wouldn't be able to check where the money is coming from.
I certainly understand that, and maybe I'm just cynical or been around politics long enough, not that long, I'm not that old, but I think that there are ways to know who's supporting you. And I think that there are ways to know.
But like in poker, you can bluff, you know, you can.
You could, I suppose. You could have I could start telling senators that I raised them $1 million
exactly.
and eat their dinners. But
exactly. And I've spoken with wealthy individuals who were
Yeah.
donating to campaigns. And before every meeting, the politician is always like, where's the money? Check if that person wired the money to my account. Otherwise, I'm not going to have a meeting with them. So unless, you know, that they know for sure that that person donated to their campaign, there's no meeting.
I think that it's an interesting proposal. And
Anyways,
it would be interesting to see how it works in practice and how you would enforce, for example, not providing a receipt that someone could then show. I mean, you would have to punish someone for providing proof of a donation in their booth? You would. I mean, at a certain point, it becomes a speech restriction in and of itself. There's a right to speak anonymously. There's also a right to speak not anonymously.
Good point.
So it's a challenge.
Well, talking about First Amendment, you had a case last week that you won. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure.
Sorry, I know we were supposed to end at 11:30.
We could do a few more minutes.
Yeah?
It's okay.
Okay, so.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. My legal practice fundamentally involves representing media and technology companies and companies that operate at the intersection of those two. And the way that people communicate and speak online has come under a lot of scrutiny in the last few years, and it's drawn legislative attention. Different states have different approaches to making speech on the internet better or safer or more conducive to their particular points of view. And so you've seen, for instance, in states like Texas and in Florida, attempts to pass laws that force social media companies and others to carry content posted by users that the social media companies themselves might prefer not to distribute, much as a newspaper doesn't have to run an op-ed or an editorial or give editorial space to someone who wants to present an opposing point of view to the newspaper's point of view or to the point of view that the newspaper published on its opinion page. At the same time, you have states like California and Connecticut and Utah and others that are passing laws to protect, they say, young people's privacy on the internet, which they really mean is to protect young people from targeted content that they think is harmful. As a result, you've got these laws which all over the country are regulating the way that websites and apps and internet services can publish and curate speech. One of the cases that I work on for an organization called NetChoice, which is one of, if not the leading advocate for free speech online, and their members include the large social media companies, but also smaller internet platforms. We brought suit against a law in California that would have been the most sweeping attempt to censor speech on the internet by, among other things, requiring any website that could potentially even be accessed by someone under the age of 18 to age verify, to estimate the age of their users, to tailor,
How do you do that without them submitting an ID?
That's what you'd have to submit government identification. Wow. You'd have to subject yourself to a facial scan or a thumbprint or something. I mean, there are ways that you could do it, but it's pretty invasive of privacy for a privacy statute, if you ask me. And beyond that, once you have to screen and suppress content that could be harmful to young people. You have to, before you offer a service or a feature on your website or on your app, you have to do a full-blown report on whether that service or feature could harm a child, including by carrying content and information that could be disturbing. So there's a war in Ukraine right now. It's important that young people are able to follow and get information about the Russian invasion. And you could imagine that at the same time it's disturbing, it's graphic, it's war. there are a lot of terrible things in the world. This law would basically impose a prior restraint on the publication of that content by informally threatening liability if you fail to screen that out from users who it could harm.
So that infringes on Section 230, where platforms are not liable for the content that gets posted?
Well, there is a part of the law that is preempted by Section 230, but what I was describing just now is a straight-up First Amendment violation. And in fact, we were supported in this case by the New York Times. The New York Times and the Student Press Law Center filed brief in our case supporting our position, challenging this law as a First Amendment violation, and talked about the way it would affect student reporting in the New York Times newspaper. There is a part of the law that is preempted by Section 230 that has many components, but one of the components that the law had required that a website or app enforce its content moderation policies in a manner that the state thought was consistent with the way those policies were written, is what they would say. At the end of the day, what it means is that you have a government censor sitting on your shoulder watching your content moderation and is there to tell you if you did it right or wrong. And so, that is not only a First Amendment issue and a prior restraint, content-based regulation, but it is barred by Section 230, which prohibits the imposition of liability based on your publication of third-party content, which what that would have done. There were other parts of the law that prohibited, using information that the website already acquired about a user to publish content to that user if the user is a child, unless the information is in the best interest of that user.
Best interest, again, what does that mean?
It's vague and overbroad. It's content-based. The important point is there's a lot of laws like this that have been passed, and we were fortunate this week to win an injunction that blocks enforcement of this law. The law was well-intentioned. I know a lot of people who worked on this law to enact it. People want to do well. They want to make the internet a better environment for kids, and there's no question that's an interest which is compelling. But they have to be very precise when you're regulating in the area of speech, and you have to have evidence to support each of the measures you're taking to achieve your goal when you're regulating in the area of speech. The legislature, unfortunately, didn't do that here, and we brought suit and we've blocked the law. And there are other laws like this in other states, and we will continue to bring suits to protect free expression on the internet, which is going to upset people on both sides. I mean, both left and right. You'll have progressive states like California passing laws like this that go too far. You'll have these conservative states like Texas and Florida that pass laws that go too far. And those cases are going to the Supreme Court. Arkansas lost a case recently. Texas lost a case recently as well, involving age verification and parental consent. There are other conservative states I mentioned, like Utah, which have laws like this, in addition to a more liberal state like Connecticut, which has a law like this. And so, the thing about free speech is you're kind of standing in the middle. And what we're protecting is a system of expression and a system of debate. And it can be abused. And as we were talking about, it could be used for improper, deleterious outcomes. It could be taken advantage of to, promote dangerous ideas. But that's the task before us as a free people in a democratic society, is to summon the wherewithal and the civic culture to withstand that and to live up to the task of self-government.
I mean, as you said, online safety is an issue. Mm-hmm. So you're not against any law that protects online safety. You're saying that it should be more specific, so that it couldn't be misused in any way.
Well, I think that what I'm saying is that protecting kids is obviously important. Protecting kids on the internet is obviously important. But you have to do the work to obtain those protections in a manner that adheres to the constitutional protections that exist for free expression.
So how would you do that if you were to make the law?
well, I try not to do my opponent's work for them when I'm litigating, but there are narrower alternatives that exist. I would point to existing privacy regulations. California has a comprehensive privacy statute. There's something called the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act at the federal level, which protects kids and uses a parent-centered approach. Both of those use a parent-centered approach to giving parents of young kids the ability to control what types of information they share. And I think if you're interested in privacy and kids' information, those approaches are certainly less speech restrictive. It's not to say that there aren't aspects of them that could be problematic, but they are less speech restrictive. So those are the types of models that I would point to.
Mm-hmm. Last question is on AI. How do you think AI will change our governance system? Are you worried about it affecting our elections? Have you thought about that?
I think it's inevitable that it'll change the way that we govern ourselves. I think that you could see the proliferation of deep fakes being better, being something that there's greater potential for misinformation, highly sophisticated misinformation, not just someone making a post that's false, but someone representing that someone did or said something. Yeah. Whether it's emulating someone's voice or image, or persuasively, visually demonstrating some kind of explosion or something like that, and making it look real. I think that that risk is real, and I think that there are efforts right now, voluntarily among the companies, to try and figure out ways to sort of come up with controls, watermarking, for example, to make clearer when something is generated by an artificial generative AI. But I think that it's going to be something that we have to deal with. But just as with social media, as with television, as with the internet, as with radio and telephones, movies, we have to integrate communications technologies into our political system and our civil society in a way that makes those tools, leaves those tools available for people to exercise expression.
Yeah.
And that's a challenge, and we've worked through these issues before, and we'll continue to work through them.
Yeah, that's always the bigger question. How do you create a law that does deal with deepfakes but doesn't infringe on the First Amendment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's challenging. I know. I'm not sure if compelled watermarking would be.
I think cryptographic signatures could be a solution.
It could be. It raises compelled speech issues and issues with respect to the types of mandatory disclosures you have to make. I think there's a framework of analysis where there's certain types of mandated disclosures that maybe could be upheld under the First Amendment. I'm not quite sure what they are. We'll have to see what they are. If they go too far, we'll sue them. But really good to talk with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Adam. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.